In the summer of 1808, a fleet appeared off the coast of Portugal. This was the advance guard of an army, and a less than promising army at that. Galvanized by the news of the Dos de Mayo uprising, the British government was scrambling to muster a force to assist the enemy of its enemy, Napoleonic France. Yet Britain did not have the best reputation at this point in the Napoleonic Wars, and neither did their allies, the Portuguese and the Spanish. On board this fleet of ships was a certain Sir Arthur Wellesley, a man who would go on to become synonymous with the British effort in the war against Napoleon. But what actually happened in those opening months of what would go on to become the Peninsular War? How did this unpromising force grow in size and manage to galvanize an entire continent by inflicting some surprise defeats on Napoleon's great men? Tonight, to mark the publication of So Just and Glorious a Cause, a book by the popular historian Rob Griffith, we talk about some of the best-known events of the 1808 campaign of the Peninsular War. We discuss the key personalities, whether or not the right people for the job were given the task of leading the British expedition to Portugal, and the impact that these events had on the early phases of the Peninsular War. This is the battles of Rolica and Vimeiro. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. To enjoy 15% off So Just and Glorious a Cause, type code NWP15 into the checkout at hellion.co.uk. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where, as you've heard, we are delving into that ever popular, evergreen topic of the Peninsular War. And we have a very popular guest rejoining me to discuss this one. Rob Griffith returns, having previously talked about his book on the 5th Battalion 60th Regiment. That's called Rifleman, appropriate enough. But this time, we're going to talk about his new release, So Just and Glorious a Cause, Britain and the Liberation of Portugal and the Battles of Rolica and Vimeiro in 1808. Rob, great to see you. It's been a long time since you've been on this show.
Yeah.
How are you doing, my friend?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, no, very sound.
I'm going to start off actually by correcting the record on myself, which is not a phrase that happens very often on this show. Not because I don't get things wrong, but because most of the time people just kind of assume I know what I'm talking about and don't correct me. Because in the past, I've said that Britain doesn't lift a finger to help Portugal when it's first invaded by the French. But you've since made the point to me that actually that's not entirely true. You know, there is an effort made in 1807. So I guess the first question is, what does happen when Napoleon decides, actually, you know what, I am going to invade Portugal, irrespective of the fact that the Portuguese have done everything that I've told them to, and caved into all of my demands. We'll park the morality of that and Napoleon and international relations and all the rest of it. But what does Britain actually do in response to that? And why does it seem to have sort of little slash no effect on the situation in Portugal?
Britain started to hear of forces massing in Bayonne in the summer of 1807, while the Copenhagen campaign was going on, and while a large portion of the British army was still making its way back from South America. The trouble was, even though they knew one of their allies was going to get invaded, there was very little they could do about it. Britain knew very well the capabilities of the Portuguese army. There'd been British troops in Portugal from 1797 to 1802. And then once the war recommenced in 1803, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Stewart was sent to basically report on the state of the Portuguese army. And he said that the army was not capable of defending the country. Its officers were either too old or too young. The men were either too old or too young. There wasn't sufficient supplies in the magazines. It was basically your typical army that's not really seen a lot of action. I mean, there was, the Portuguese army did fairly well in the 1790s in the Pyrenees with the Spanish against the French, but it was much needed, much needed reform, and there have been several attempts at reform, getting former officers of the Prussian army over to lick the army into shape, but they'd all been stymied by the interests of the aristocracy and that type of thing. So basically, Britain knew that there was no way that Portugal could be defended. So then it was the question of, well, what can they do? And the policy that came up and was in fact codified in a treaty in October with Portugal was that Britain would help the Portuguese monarch, Prince John, to travel across the Atlantic to the Portuguese colony of Brazil. And that would have two benefits. Obviously, it would retain Prince John's throne. He wouldn't be a vassal of Napoleon, which, never works out well for the monarch in question. And also, it would move the Portuguese fleet across the Atlantic and out of the way of Napoleon. And a lot of people think that Napoleon was after Portugal because they weren't part of the continental system, but that was pretty much just an excuse. What Napoleon really wanted was the Portuguese fleet and access to the Portuguese colonies. So by getting Prince John and the fleet across, Britain would, solve that. Basically, Napoleon would have Portugal, but he'd not have what he wanted. And of course, a nice byproduct would be it would open Brazil up to British trade. So Britain knew, Portugal couldn't be defended, but part of the treaty was that Britain would send a Royal Naval Squadron to help the Portuguese across the Atlantic. So Rear Admiral Sir Sidney Smith was sent with several ships of the line and got to Portugal as the French were approaching and assisted, in the embarkation and the evacuation. While that was happening, there were 8,000 troops commanded by Major General Brent Spencer that were gathering in southern Britain to travel to Sicily to reinforce the garrison there. And incidentally, there was a force of about the same size under Sir John Moore coming back from Sicily. So it was a standard rotation of troops. So Spencer's orders were changed to basically call in at Lisbon and see what he could do, and so was Moore's. Moore never got the orders, so sailed on past. But Spencer was going to go to Lisbon, but they sailed in December after the embarkation had already taken place, but they didn't know that. So they sailed in December, but were blown back by storm. The convoy was scattered. Half it did end up in Sicily, but the other half didn't. And because of the storms, they didn't actually sail again until February. So there was no actual troops that turned up. If they had turned up, the plan was to help cover the evacuation. That was all. But there was no way that even 8,000 troops. And don't forget, these were reinforcements. They weren't an expedition. They didn't have any any commissariats. They only had limited artillery, no horses, no cavalry. So all they could have done would be to help defend the port against the French, while Prince John and the rest of the court and the government sailed away. So there was basically nothing Britain could do to stop Napoleon, but they did manage to stop him achieving his aims.
That story of the evacuation is spectacular. You've literally got people galloping through the streets, getting on these ships just as the French are kind of coming over the last of the hills, looking out on the city. It's Juno basically pitches up just in time to see the Portuguese monarchy sail away with the treasury kind of stuffed on board. It's a beautiful story. But it is interesting, the contrast between what you're saying here. A careful assessment has taken place, right? And everybody's gone, we can't do it. We can't help Portugal. We can't help the Portuguese army to defend the borders or even launch a campaign in the interior. And yet when the Dos de Mayo happens, everything seems to change. or at least that's our perception. Is it fair to say that none of this would have happened in 1808? And how much of what happens in terms of sending troops out is, hey, let's go help the Spanish, only for Wellesley to pitch up and realize that the Spanish don't particularly want him to be there. They want his money and they want his guns, but they really don't want his troops.
I mean, liberating Portugal, in isolation from anything to do with Spain, was never going to happen. If British troops had managed to land there, there are sufficient troops in Spain to completely wipe them out. French troops. So it was never considered, never an option, and strategically, Portugal wasn't important. The strategic, the aim of denying the fleet and getting the colony had already been achieved. So there was no real benefit to trying to liberate Portugal. But once the Dos de Mayo happened, it had several important effects. Firstly, obviously, a large portion of the occupation force in Portugal was Spanish. There are three divisions, of Spanish who occupied what is now the Algarve, and also the region around Oporto and the north of Portugal. And the French only actually occupied Lisbon and the sort of central area. So even before May, some of the Spanish units had been withdrawn, which left a bit of a vacuum, which the Portuguese were all too happy to fill. I mean, there'd been riots and small rebellions, right from the get-go in December 1807, straight after the French occupation. And the occupation had been a harsh one. The French never did things particularly kindly. And things like the Portuguese army was disbanded, and the best part of it marched away to France to die in the Russian campaign in 1812. They'd done things like confiscate all the weapons, and so it was a fairly harsh regime. But once the Spanish troops started to go, that opened up an opportunity for the revolts to basically start up, and most of them were fairly spontaneous. The most significant one was in Oporto, where the Spanish troops, before they left, actually arrested the French governor and handed the city back over to the Portuguese. And then, all across the Algarve, little ports and little towns, would revolt. And so, the Dos de Mayo was vital to encouraging the Portuguese to revolt and allowing them the space to do it as well. But also, as you said, when the Spanish diplomats got to London from Spain soon after May 1808, I think it was June or July they turned up. They were asking for arms and arms and money, because they didn't want British troops. They just had French troops land, and that didn't turn out very well, did it? The French troops had come as allies, and soon changed that. So, and also Britain and Spain had been at war something like 40 years out of the previous 100. So Trafalgar was only a few years ago, so there was no appetite in Spain for British troops at all. Although there was very good communication between the British and the Spanish, especially in the south, from Gibraltar. The commander-in-chief there, Sir Hugh Dalrymple, was communicating directly with General Castanos. And so, there was, and even Spencer, who'd been in Gibraltar, was off Cadiz about 2 weeks after the 2nd of May. So the British were there offering support, from the get-go. And the Spanish just basically said, no, we don't want you. But if you occupy Portugal, and obviously the Portuguese were revolting at this time and asking for help as well, and they were asking for troops. So you had Spain who were saying just give us the cash, and you had Portugal saying, look, we need men. And so when Wellesley sailed, his orders were actually to check in at Corunna first. And there was sufficient flexibility in his orders that if the people at Corunna had said, look, we need you here, that's where the expedition would have stopped, and they'd have offloaded at Corunna. So Portugal was very much a bright, not an end, it was a mean.
I think that's a really nice way of putting it, isn't it? And as you kind of say, I just love this moment where the British go, fantastic, we've got somebody that we can maybe help out, and this is going to create an opening, perhaps. How about we send an army? And Spanish go, no, money, money, thank you, nothing else. Oh, guns, yes, please. But no. And if folks are wondering what is the Dos de Mayo, and if they want more on just how significant the money factor plays into a lot of the discussions in the early stages, back along, I did some exclusive episodes with Josh Provan and Silvio Gregorio Sainz on the early period of the Peninsular War. Those are about to go up in the coming weeks for you to enjoy on the main draw. So keep an eye out, and all will be explained on those. But we're going to focus on the situation in Portugal. What's happened in the intervening time from the evacuation of the monarchy to Wellesley's expedition landing? You mentioned how this regime has been quite harsh. The French have kind of scooped up all of the arms and removed those. What sort of a state is Portugal in, or actually hasn't there been a long enough kind of time for people to really feel the bite of the French occupation?
They were. I mean, one of the issues was Portugal could never feed itself. It always imported more food. I had to import food. So the British blockade wasn't doing anybody any favors. And also, the other major economic factor was that with all the aristocracy, sailing away to Brazil, there were lots of servants and all the merchants who provided the aristocracy with their luxury goods and stuff were all out of work.
Oh, of course.
So there was quite a lot of economic hardship, and you mix that with a clergy who were very anti-French because the French were anti-clergy, and there was an awful lot of unrest. And as I said, there were riots several times in Lisbon and other cities, and by July. The Portuguese had fought a battle, a fairly pitched battle with the French at Evora. And as I said, the Algarve was basically liberated. Porto was liberated. All the north was liberated. So, a lot of the work had been done before Wellesley even sailed. And also, it's very, very important to note the part the Royal Navy had in all this. Vice Admiral Sir Charles Cotton had taken over from Sidney Smith in early 1808, and he'd been blockading Lisbon and Porto and the other small ports. And as soon as the uprising began, he began to get requests for arms, and so he was shipping whatever muskets he could scrounge from the fleet. And basically, the title "So Just and Glorious Cause" is taken from a letter Cotton sent to one of the local uprisings. He was basically helping the revolt in any way he could. And one of the things that happened was a small town, Figueira de Foz, on the mouth of the Mondego River. And the locals there had taken a small fort and asked for Royal Marines to help man it. And so Cotton sent 200 Royal Marines, and then a further 100. So by the time Wellesley pitched up there were 300 Royal Marines already there, which I'm sure most Royal Marines would say is fairly typical in most operations, that the Marines are there long before the army. But and also Spencer, who was sailing from Cadiz towards Lisbon, again had stopped off at the Algarve and various other places and helped out there. So an awful lot had happened, and it was basically only the central portion of around Lisbon that was still under French control, plus also Almeida and Elvas, the big border fortresses. And Juno had actually contracted all his forces in as much as he could because he knew he didn't have the manpower to defend the whole country.
Absolutely. I mean, Juno's no fool, and that's an important thing to
But
bear in
actually,
mind.
you read
Are
you,
we going to have controversy here? I
you
mean,
read.
he's an inveterate looter. Don't get me wrong.
Oh yeah, no, but also he was only really given the command because Napoleon wanted him out of the way.
Okay.
Um, he was apparently having an affair with Murat's wife,
I mean, that's ballsy because,
and
Murat
yeah,
doesn't take such insults lying down.
and he'd also been involved in some basically financial mismanagement. As governor of Paris, he was basically fiddling the books, and he'd got like he was getting far too much money out of the state, and Napoleon wasn't happy with him. So I think Napoleon gave him the command because he expected that there'd be no resistance. It'd be an easy job. But Gino was a man whose biggest command previously had been a brigade at the Battle of Nazareth of 400 men. He had no command experience really. He'd only been an aide to Napoleon.
Oh, interesting. Because in my head, Juno is, he's not an imbecile. There are some people who so you look at and go, what the hell are you doing? I didn't have that image of him in my head,
Yeah,
which is
and also
really
if you read his letters to Napoleon, he's such a whiny little. Yeah, he's
mhm,
just basically saying, "Please, Napoleon, tell me what to do. I've tried really hard." It's really quite a you know amusing tone to it, really, because he's obviously out of his depth. And also, of course, there is the question of whether he's suffering from a traumatic brain injury.
okay.
He'd been hit in the head several times. Um, you know, so and his mental illness would eventually cause his death. Um, he, I think it was can't remember the year, 1813. He was getting increasingly erratic and um, decided that he could fly and jumped out a window, broke his leg, which then got infected and that kind of thing. Yeah, his is not a happy story at all.
No.
Yeah, so and a lot of the comments, perhaps written after the fact, but from Foy and Thibault, who were with the expedition, basically say that his decline was starting, at this time.
Interesting.
So
Every
he,
day is a learning day. This is why I love doing this show. You think you have a perception of somebody, and actually you get told, no, Zach, you're just wrong. Which is admittedly not an unusual
I'm
occurrence
not
on
saying
this show.
I'm not
But
saying he was completely useless. I'm just saying
no,
he
but
wasn't the job as knife in the pack.
no, okay. Well, that changes. Hmm. Okay, we'll park that and come back to it Vimeiro, because I look at what happens at Vimeiro and kind of go, this seems sort of sound, sort of typical. So we'll get back to Vimeiro in due course. Um, let's talk about the British force, shall we? Um, I, there are so many bits of this story, the opening sort of salvo, if you will, of the Peninsular War that I dearly love. We've covered a number of them already, but another one is the fact that the army that we send out under Wellesley, firstly, isn't really meant to be under Wellesley, and it sort of goes, and everyone's kind of going, yeah, um, but also it's where it's meant to go. It's meant to go and create havoc in the colonies of the Spanish in the New World. And it gets diverted to go and support the uprising of the metropole, i.e., Spain, against France. It's a wonderful indication of how Britain can be hugely Machiavellian and utterly pragmatic when a situation arises. Um, so this force is really destined for Mexico, I believe, is sort of one of these.
Yeah, I mean,
Is
it's
it
sort
sort
of
of the north coast
it
of
was
South
like
America, and then the idea is to create problems and maybe Mexico sort of a
yeah, I
thing
think
that
the
they can focus on.
first stop was meant to be Cartagena, what is now Venezuela, and then possibly Mexico. Yeah, but one thing that is completely baffling to me in a way, is the persistence of the British desire to do something in South America. I'm editing a Jacqueline Writer's book on Popham at the moment, and obviously he's neck deep in it. But there is a constant wish to do something in South America, not from any great, we want more colonies, because that hadn't worked out well in America, previously. But what they wanted was to deny Napoleon the money was coming. Because basically there had been a treaty between France and Spain that Spain paid France an indemnity. So all the money coming out of what's now Argentina and the other colonies was basically going, a lot of it was going to France. And the British didn't want Spain and a French ally to have all those resources, which then feed the French war machine. So despite two disasters around Buenos Aires, there are still plans to do something in South America. And Wellesley had been at the heart of this. I mean, there were some wild schemes about one force going via the West Indies to Mexico, and another force going via the Philippines and India, or India and the Philippines, and hitting the other side at the same time. Which would never.
Yeah, because the coordination on that one was really going to work, wasn't it?
Exactly. But anyway, so Wellesley had been helping the government plan these and was given command, and right up to sort of June, early July, the plan was for that force. Was not necessarily to definitely go to South America, but it was certainly on the cards. Early draft of his orders were basically turn up at Spain, see if you can do something. If not, go across the Atlantic. But the trouble was, if you plan a force for South America, it's not necessarily ideal for acting in Europe. A lot of the troops, probably about 3/4 of the infantry battalions, had been involved in South American expeditions in 1806 and 1807, and had got back to Ireland at the end of 1807, and had been in around Ireland rebuilding their strength. So it could be that they were chosen because they knew the area of the expedition, and also the prime rifle element in Wellesley's force was the 60th. The 60th Royal American Regiment, as the name suggests, they were meant to be acting in America, and they'd been in the north of South America for several years, only a few years previously. So there's some evidence that a lot of the infantry were chosen because it was due to go to South America. But the biggest influence that the South American question had on the expedition was the lack of horses. You can't take horses across the Atlantic. They just, they don't travel well. And if you read the book, there's some particularly graphic section on what exactly can happen to a horse at sea. So I recommend you read that unless you're squeamish. But so there's only one regiment of cavalry, the 20th Light Dragoons, who were set to go. I think 384 cavalrymen and only about 230 horses. There were also a problem with the horses for the artillery. Once he found he was going to Spain or Iberia, Wellesley had to hunt around and actually get horses from the Irish Commissariat, who were basically retired cavalry horses, not in a great state. There's a lot of debate as to whether Wellesley asked the ordnance for horses and was told no, or whether he didn't ask. There's letters that go back and forth and stuff. But the fact was, there were enough artillery horses in Cork. During my research, it is in the National Archives. You just put a search term in, or you start looking through the catalogue, and I found there was sections for returns of the Royal Artillery drivers and horses. So I looked up the returns, and it turns out there are plenty of horses in Cork and nearby.
Wow.
So
I would
if
have
there'd
loved
been,
to have been a fly on the wall if Wellesley ever actually learnt that.
well, he must have
Um,
done, 'cause, but there was like two or three hundred horses in Cork and the surrounding area, which so there must have been a Royal Artillery barracks he must have known about.
mm,
You know, but it's
that's
bizarre, there wasn't, but it's all to do with the way that the army is separate from the ordnance.
true.
So it's not as though he could pull rank and go to an army guy and say, look, you give me your horses, because it was a different department. You know, but the lack of horses and lack of cavalry would have a serious effect on the expedition. I don't think in terms of the infantry selected, it had a major effect. The regiments were selected. If you look at their inspection reports, all perfectly adequate. A lot of them had received drafts from militia, and there's two regiments, the 36th and the 45th, who were added at the last minute. They were particularly heavy in recruits. Apart from that, they're all sound units.
And their morale is just off the charts when you read the accounts. The arrogance and the belief that, well, we're British, therefore we're going to win, just really strikes home, or to me at least, from what I've read.
Yeah,
So
and the trouble with memoirs, though, it's a very self-selecting bunch, isn't it?
yeah, it is.
So um, I think the most striking account I had was from I found was from a soldier of the 38th, and their letters, and very raw letters, and that kind of thing does give you a different appearance to the memoirs, who are perhaps more gung ho and written after the fact.
So that's the British army. Let's look at the French side of things. How are these troops coping? Bearing in mind what you've said about, Juno's had to kind of pull things back, and the nearest support troops, inverted commas, are in Almeida or in Elvash, which, frankly, they might as well be on Mars for all the use they're going to be when Wellesley's going to land. Um, how are they kind of dealing with this whole situation, and what kind of troops are we talking about? Because they get a kind of a hammering in their own right just in the march into Spain for the occupation, don't they? So, and reinforcements aren't easily available once the sort of the contraction of the situation takes hold. So, have they managed to sort of rebuild in that intervening window, or are there still problems?
The force originated from the camps which were based around the Channel Coast, which were there for basically, training men and covering, any raids by the British. And Napoleon ordered 25,000 men, for the invasion, and 25,000 men had to be found. And the vast majority, if there's a French historian called Grasset who went through, he wrote his own history of the Peninsular War and went through a lot of the returns for the units. And some units were like three-quarters recruits. So these are conscripts from the 1807 and 1808 classes who, a lot of them who'd been called up early. So a lot of the French units, I said, they were third and fourth battalions of regiments, whereas the first and second were meant to be the front line. And so a lot of them were, very raw recruits. There were large Italian contingents, and there was the Legion de Midi, which was basically an Italian unit, but also a lot of the light infantry units had basically been in the Piedmontese army, but when France annexed Piedmont, they became French. So the lot of Italians there, and they were just basically poor quality troops. They were same with Juno. They had a poor commander, poor quality troops, and it was because they were going up against poor quality opposition. The march across across Spain and Portugal was horrendous. Mainly because Napoleon looked at a map and thought, "I'll just go that way. It's nice and direct," without actually considering the terrain. And they went through a very mountainous and barren area, and there are people just dropping out dead and being killed by Portuguese peasants, and they lost most of their artillery. So the march itself, was very poor. When they got to Lisbon, they were basically barefoot and in rags. But obviously, over the winter, they did rebuild. They had about 4,000, 5,000 replacements come from France during the winter. But once the revolt started, of course, they couldn't do any training because they couldn't go out, without any risk of being, slaughtered. Um, Several of the units obviously fought the rebels and they beat them because obviously they were, even though they're poor quality troops, they were formed troops rather than peasants with pitchforks. So several, there have been several fairly major clashes. But also there was, on those occasions, they lost control and ended up slaughtering hundreds of Portuguese civilians. So there's certainly a lack of discipline amongst them. Which didn't bode well for them facing, a formed army like the British. But so, and if you read, the accounts of the officers and stuff, they, by July, August, they knew the game was up.
Interesting.
The news from Spain wasn't good. Rumors kept on happening of the British appearing and causing scares. And as soon as the British did land, they knew that was it.
That's very interesting. We will come back to kind of strategic options in due course, I think, because that's always an area of debate. Could Juno have cut and run, and was that the smart thing to do, or was it better to try and tough it out? But we'll park that for a second. I'm very conscious that when Wellesley lands, he has sort of conversations with the locals, the local sort of militia forces. I'm not entirely sure if you can legitimately talk about a regular army because, as you've alluded to, the army gets disbanded. So anything that reforms technically probably isn't official. But anyway, sort of the Portuguese insurgent forces, certainly Wellesley doesn't rank them, and has concerns. And I think, if I've remembered this rightly, and granted, it's been a little while since I read up on this, but I'm thinking back to Rory Muir sort of talking about this and saying how the the Portuguese are more keen to work in a combined arms manner with Wellesley than Wellesley really is in terms of working with the Portuguese. He doesn't really want them diluting the quality and therefore seeing his army sort of swept away if something goes wrong. What do we know about this sort of insurgent army, inverted commas, at this point in time? Is there much in the way of sources, or is it all kind of
Yeah.
smatterings?
No, I mean, there was a couple of British officers at Oporto, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Brown and Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Trant. They were both working with the junta in Oporto, and they were sending back detailed reports, on the Portuguese forces, which weren't good. If you think about it, the Portuguese army's been disbanded. The best men are in France. The best officers have sailed across to Brazil. So all you've got are, bits and pieces of militia, people who deserted from the army marching to France. And they had no weapons, they had no uniforms, and so there are regiments in name only, a lot of them. But they were fighting for their country, and they were quite committed, to that cause. A lot of the units in Porto were actually clergy. And so a whole mix of people. The units that actually made up the field army, as it were a mix of students, peasants. They had no. All the reports from the British officers were they've got no discipline. There's no officers, no NCOs, and that's why it would take the British a couple of years to rebuild the Portuguese army. Starting in 1809. So it wasn't an ideal ally, but fair play to them. They had managed to take most of the country back. So Yeah, I think it's a lot of the British opinions are quite chauvinistic, and I think a little unfair, really. If Napoleon had managed to wipe out the British regular army, how much resistance would the volunteers and the militia have been able to put up? It's that kind of thing.
Sure. And you set that up really nicely in terms of kind of helping people to understand quite why it is that the British kind of say, well, look, if we're going to do this, we need to rebuild from scratch, and we're going to parachute in some of our own officers
Yeah.
because that officer, um, I don't want to use the word officer class, but that sort of cadre of officers, it's just gone. It's
Yeah.
they've either been killed or they, as you say, are in Brazil. Um, so it does take a while to rebuild, and it's not really until 1810, excuse me, that's really kind of come into play and sort of produced a cohesive force that then stands alongside the British at Basako. Back to 1808, though, it always strikes me that this early stage feels very sort of flying by the seat of your pants. Um, Talk us through what goes on. You kind of talked about the fact that the British already have that toehold because the Marines have occupied this fort near Figueira de Foz. Is that fort still there, by the
Yes,
way?
it's a restaurant now.
Oh, there we go. So if you're ever on tour, folks, there's a place to stop off for lunch. And talk us through what goes on and why is there so much confusion over Spencer's reinforcements? Because this really gets on Wellington's nerves, and he basically kind of goes, "There's no logic to what this guy has done. Why isn't he where I want him to be?" So just talk us through that whole process.
I think it's a little unfair, and let's face it, Wellesley could often be unfair. Um, he Spencer had been at Gibraltar, basically waiting for something to happen. He'd initially, after the Lisbon orders had been countermanded, his objective had been Quetta, a Spanish colony on the North African coast, but that was deemed too strong. So him and his 5,000 men were basically waiting in Gibraltar, partly waiting for the rest of them, the companies that had been split and managed to get to Sicily to come back. But once the Dostomero happened and Dalrymple was in close touch with the Spanish in the south and around Cadiz, Spencer went to Cadiz to offer his help, along with there's a Royal Naval Squadron there, and they basically offered to help take the French squadron, which had been there since Trafalgar. The Spanish said, "No, thanks, we can do this on our own," and they did. They took the French squadron, and soon afterwards, Spencer, because his troops had been on board ship for so long, had got permission to land some troops at a port, Santa Maria, just across from Cadiz. So they were actually the first British troops, in the peninsula. And so there was plans for Spencer to march with the Spanish army to hit the French. But then once Bailén happened, and the Spanish victory at Bailén, which basically wiped out the French in the south, they weren't needed anymore. Okay. But there were letters going back and forth from Dalrymple to the government and from Spencer to Dalrymple and Spencer to the government, basically saying, the south's still a fairly logical place for you to come. Because, there's a good port. It helps protect the entrance to the Mediterranean. There's lots of good reasons why the south was a good option, and perhaps it would have been better than going north. But anyway, so there were letters going back and forth, and basically letters from Spencer to Wellesley saying what he was doing were crossing ones from Wellesley to Spencer saying, "Please do this." And so it was just a matter of, take a week for a letter to go, from one to the other. But before Wellesley actually ordered Spencer north, Spencer had worked out that he couldn't do anything in the south and was heading north anyway. So he was, he actually met the order coming from Wellesley, saying come here, when he was already on the way. So it's just a matter of, it's very easy to judge things with, based on today's instantaneous communication. Whereas, it could take a week for, as I said, for a ship to sail around, from one to the other, and they could get blown off course, they could miss each other, loads of things could happen. So, yeah, Spencer does, sorry, Wellesley does get annoyed, but he often gets annoyed. So,
He certainly does. And I think it's easy to forget just how thickly the fog of war lies on all commanders, more so during this period even than today. This, obviously everybody knows it's not the age of satellite navigation and all the rest of it, but it is incredibly hard to know what the hell is happening 5 miles away, far less trying to coordinate, a concentration of forces across an entire continent, all to be
yeah,
at one place at one time.
and even as a historian, you're looking at the big ledgers of the letters in National Archives, and you can tell well when someone wrote a letter, but you can't always tell when the person received it. And so you get, as I said, you get these letters that obviously crossed each other, and so you don't quite know exactly when Wellesley was getting the Spencer's replies.
Yeah, I mean, this is the hilarious thing about writing about India. You could clearly see the British government sort of has an agenda and wants a certain thing done. But of course, if you're out in India, you know that you're 18 months away from a reply. So if you don't like something, you just create facts on the ground, craft your own solution. And a letter can come from London saying, I want you to do this. But sorry, mate, we've already we've created our own solution, and you will like it because it's going to take you 18 months to get the fact that you don't like it communicated to me anyway. Um, but we're straying from the Peninsular War. Apologies. The landing itself goes fairly well.
Yep.
We've talked about how negotiations with the locals are perhaps a little bit sketchy. I don't know if you want to sort of say a little bit more about that, but I'm also keen to move us to the action.
Well,
The first,
sorry.
go ahead, mate.
No, I think it's just worth noting that it wasn't that the Portuguese didn't want to fight. Freire, the local Portuguese commander, was more concerned about going inland to protect areas that had already been liberated, and basically stop the French coming out of Lisbon and looting and raping their way, back across areas which were safe. Whereas Wellesley, was knew that he had to stay close to the coast so he could get supplies from the Navy, and if it all went wrong, he could get taken off by the Navy. So the two commanders had very different strategic goals, basically. But Freire did compromise, and 2,000 troops were given to Wellesley, which some of which proved useful.
And the first significant skirmish of the British involvement in the Peninsula, obviously not the first combat of the Peninsula as a whole, because we need to get away from that kind of Anglo-centric. It only kicks off when the British turn up. It doesn't. The Spanish have many clashes before this point. But the first significant skirmish for the British during this conflict is Obidos.
Yeah.
I've probably done a horrendous job on the pronunciation there. I'm still working on my Portuguese accent. It's a very slow work in progress, folks, as you've just realized. So what happened?
So Wellesley was marching his troops basically down the coast road, and the landing was about 90 miles north of Lisbon, so there was fair way to go. And they landed on the first. They were all ashore by the 8th, and by the 15th, they'd arrived at a place called Caldas de Reina, and Wellesley, the main force stayed there, and Wellesley sent 3 companies of the 5th, 60th, and one of the 2nd, 95th forward with some light greens to probe towards Obidos, which is a lovely walled town about 2 or 3 miles south of Caldas de Reina. Junot had sent Delaborde with a couple of thousand troops as a blocking force, and they were near the town or village of Rolica, and there were pickets forward around Obidos and occupying the town. So the riflemen of the 60th and 95th turn up, and the French pickets open fire. And here's where things get slightly unclear, because all the British accounts come from the 95th, no accounts from the 60th. Something that frustrated me hugely when I was writing the history of them. The 95th guys seem to put pen to paper, drop of a hat. the 60th were in the Peninsula longer, and nobody thought about actually writing anything. But anyway, so all our accounts come from the 95th, none from the 60th, or the 20 or so light dragoons who were with them. And we have Wellesley's report, and we have a couple of reports from staff officers or officers who were back at Cal d'Estrades with the main body. So it's not entirely, you can't say for definite what happened. There's, I think, one French account from a Swiss officer. So even from the French side, you can't say for certain. But what seems to have happened is that a body of riflemen, and it's not clear if it's just the 95th or some of the 60th as well. And bearing in mind, you had 4 companies of light infantry, advancing. They would not advance as one block. The standard tactical doctrine was half of any skirmishing force would be formed as a reserve. So it's likely that at least 1 or 2 companies are out at front, and then another couple of companies, to the rear. There's one account which does make it sound as though it's only the 95th that got a bit carried away. Because what happened is they opened fire, the French pickets retired, and the 95th chased after them for probably about 2 or 3 miles. Now, you've been to Obidos on Rolica, and it's a short drive between one and the other, but it is about 2 or 3 miles. And from the accounts, you can guess they were pretty much at Rolica by the time they came up against the main French body and had to leg it back. Major General Spencer appears to have saved the day to some extent. He, I think, would have brought, by the sounds of it, brought up the reserve of those 4 companies. So whatever had been formed in the rear, he brought them up and then helped the whole to retire in good order back towards Obidos. It was not the first time that casualties would be caused by inexperienced officers getting carried away, which is basically what happened. The 95th Company, incidentally, was led by Captain Hercules Pakenham, who was Wellesley's brother-in-law. The brother of his wife. And one officer in the 95th gets killed, and several riflemen in the 95th and 60th get killed. So it's there are losses, and there's quite a few prisoners taken. So it's not the rifleman's finest hour, unfortunately. Wellesley calls it quite useless, and a couple of private letters, he's quite scathing. That they've got so carried away.
I do wish Arthur would tell us what he really thought on occasion. Why does he hold back so much? If anything can give you an indication of the character of Sir Arthur Wellesley, it is certainly his letters. And there's another pearl of an example. He doesn't change, folks. If you're not familiar with how he goes on, if anything, he becomes more acerbic the higher he goes up the army. So that sets the stage for, of course, the Battle of Rolica. Yeah. Or Rolica. Hard to know which, because it's got a circumflex on the sea. And I'm pretty sure that my attempts to pronounce it the French way are wrong. Now, it's probably not really intended as a battle. That's my read of it, certainly from the French perspective. You've got, I believe it's Delaborde, holding basically a rear guard, and his job, as I understand it from Juno, is hold them up, delay, buy time. And we'll break this down because there's the first position and then the second position, and I have opinions on the second position. Big surprise, I have strongly held opinions on things. Shock. But the battle as a whole doesn't seem to go the way that either side wants it to. So let's start with what the plans are on both sides. Apologies, I have sort of slightly spoilt it in relation to Delaborde by spouting my mouth off, but talk us through it.
If you ever go to Obidos, it's, as I said, it's wall town, and you can walk up the walls if you've got the nerve, because there's no safety barrier. But if you go to the southern end of the town, you can walk up a tower, which actually gives you a view of the Rolica battlefield. So you can imagine, and that's actually where Wellesley looks out at the French positions the morning of the battle. You can see the first position around the actual village of Rolica, and you can see the hills behind. And I don't believe that Wellesley looked at that and thought, oh, they're going to make a stand at the first position. I think he looked at that and thought, it's obvious they're going to fall back. So Wellesley's plan was to send the Portuguese units around the flank on the right, to send General Ferguson with 2 brigades behind the hills on the left, and then to march up the Central Valley with his main force. He fully expected Ferguson, in fact, Ferguson's orders were to go to a village called Bombaral, which is far in the rear of the second position. So Wellesley's plan was basically to envelop the French. The French plan was basically to hold, to make the British deploy, to make them, have a plan, to make them march up the valley and deploy into line. And as soon as anything got too dangerous, the French would fall back from the first position to the second position, and then further back again. So the plans for both were quite clear, but Delaborde executed his plan very well. Wellesley did not. And the reason why things didn't go well are unclear. The Portuguese seem to have marched merrily on their way on the right and had no real part of the action. There was a battalion of Caçadores with the central portion, who were mostly students from Coimbra, who ran towards the French and then ran back, apparently. But most of the Portuguese had little part in the action. Ferguson's 2 brigades got on quite well. Fane, who commanded the 60th and the 95th in the Light Brigade, he was fighting up the hills on the left of the valley, driving the French pickets back. Hill, the 1st British Brigade, deployed in front of Delaborde's first position. And as soon as Hill began to deploy, Delaborde withdrew. Ferguson, at this point, should have been, well into the hills at the back. And there's 2 accounts which basically say an order came. One says explicitly that it was from Wellesley. Another kind of implies it was the staff officer making things up as he went along. And there's one account from Lord Burgess, who wrote a history of the campaign, which basically blames it on an error with an order. But whatever the cause, Ferguson he was actually close to Bombaral, had to double back and march back into the valley. So instead of doing the enveloping and basically getting to the second French position before the French, he was down in front of the French position, the French second position. And his troops basically had no further part in the action. Delaborde, because of his superiority in cavalry, could take his time getting from the first position up into the hills. There was, skirmishing, with the light companies and the French light infantry and the riflemen and the French light infantry, but no significant casualties on either side really. And then you're faced with the French being up, a very steep hill. It's a series of steep hills, isn't it? It's it's a very imposing position, but not a very long position. The French, was only a few hundred meters, long. And so again, they're all, obviously, with only a couple of thousand troops. And this is one of the debates. Wellesley claims that the French were 6,000 strong. They're actually about 2,000. So with only 2,000 men, there was a limited amount of real estate the French could occupy, and the British were always going to be able to outflank them. So with the main flanking force, Ferguson, basically out of action, marching back towards the valley. It was Fane's riflemen who started on one flank, on the left flank, and Hill took his brigade, the light companies and the 9th and the 5th from his brigade foot, up on the right flank. And again, what should have happened is those flanking maneuvers should have had time to develop, but the Nightingale's Brigade of the 29th and 82nd, who were meant to basically, fix the front, got a bit carried away again. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Lake, who was in charge of the 29th, um, he was he'd been in the army for a long time, but he was the son of General Lake, who'd been commander in chief in India, and he spent most of his career as an aide de camp to his father. He'd only taken over the 29th basically the day before they'd sailed from Britain in December. There was part of Spencer's force. So he was not a very experienced regimental commander. He hadn't been he hadn't led a battalion in action before. And as far as I can tell, as the 29th were approaching the hill, marching through the village there, they came under fire, and Lake took his men up. Either the wrong defile or the right defile too soon, or the wrong defile and too soon. It depends on the which account that you look at. But basically, he took his men up a very narrow defile, the French on either side, and they get slaughtered. They do manage to rally at one point in an olive grove, sort of halfway up the hill, but their colours get taken, and they're only really saved by the 9th Foot coming up on the at the side of them. So and the 29th takes something like half the casualties of the British that day. It's a very confused action. Again, you've got few accounts to work from. All the British accounts mention overwhelming numbers of French. The French general Brenier basically says it was 2 companies of the 70th Line who stopped them. But either way, it was a very bloody affair, and it needn't have happened.
No, that's the baffling thing about the whole thing. And I do get the sense that sort of Delabor kind of gets does, as you say, does very well in that move from the first position to the second, but then somehow kind of gets over engaged, if you will, and kind of, I wouldn't say sucked into a battle that he doesn't want to fight, but sort of ends up, because it ends up being so messy and so bloody, he ends up having to put more men into it than I think he wanted. It's worth just saying a little bit about the geography. I mean, we're talking about hills as if they're sort of the little lovely English hills that you get in our wonderful rolling countryside. The first time I saw the second position, I won't repeat it because my phrasing was impolite. But I will say it was Germanic in its nature. It's unlike almost anything I'd seen, and sure, it was sort of the early stages of my trip out there. So I would go on to look at places like Basako, and that's a real mountain, but it's it's much bigger than you would imagine it to be from the descriptions. And one of the best indicators folks can get is to actually have a little look at the print that is done by, oh, what's the name? Is it Heath who does the um
Yeah,
the famous one? And actually, his geography, it's, I would actually say it's a little bit back to front in terms of how he's drawn those hills. But it's a good representation of just how horrendous a climb this is. And I say that because I climbed it twice and did not enjoy the experience in the slightest. In fact, actually, I called you, didn't I? From we had a video conference, as you do, as all people do on holiday. Historians regularly call each other by video chat and go, so yeah, I'm standing on this part that is very narrow here. And so do we think this is the place? And we had a chat about exactly the defile that you're talking about, because as I understand it, the description is, in places it was sort of 3 or 4 men wide, that kind of narrowness.
exactly.
Now the
I think
challenge today, of course, is that it's completely covered with foliage, as is Basako. So it's much harder to get a proper sense of what did it look like back then, but that's progress and flora and fauna and all the rest of it.
I mean, one of the accounts from the officers compares it to the Malvern Hills, and for me, it brought back nightmares of my first secondary school was in Church Stretton in Shropshire, and we used to go for cross country runs up the hills there, and it's that kind of scale. It's like Welsh foothills, type scale hills, isn't it? And they're rocky. You know, they would have been covered in brush, and a lot of the accounts from the 95th and the 60th, the 95th, say that they were basically having to wade through, knee high, thickets, of gorse and that type of thing. So it would not have been a pleasant place to fight. And Wellesley criticised Lake for not clearing the sides with his light infantry, which is curious because the light infantry weren't under Lake's command. The light companies were under the command of the brigade commander. And it's curious that the brigade commander was Nightingale, or Nightingale, depending on where you get the spelling from. And nobody mentions him. Plenty of people mention Ferguson and Spencer, but nobody mentioned, there's some, and Fane, he gets mentioned later, but Nightingale is just never mentioned in any of the accounts. And so, even though, yes, Lake gets a lot of the blame, he did have a brigade commander above him who presumably should have been sorting something out.
So I think that's quite harsh when you look at how, oh, just deploy the light infantry on the flanks as if, they've got to walk up a slope that you would, witness in Belgium or something. Send light infantry up those hills. What are you going to give them, like crampons and climbing axes and things? Because in places that's what they're going to need. I must admit, I did not enjoy climbing back up the second time.
The other thing to remember, of course, is that even once the French were pushed from that second position, the country, to the rear is also a series of hills. I said Delaborde kept on, marching his troops back, making a little stand, marching them back. So, and with the complete lack of cavalry the British had, there was very little the British could do about it. And so, to me, even though yes, it's a British victory because they end up holding the ground. At the end of the day, Delaborde did his job, and his plan went. Yes, he probably took more casualties than he wanted, but Wellesley's plan, did not go the way he wanted.
No, I mean, far from sort of crushing the force, it very much sort of lives to fight another day. So let's talk about Juno again at this point in time. He knows the British are coming. Wellesley will go on to pause at Porto Novo, have more troops land. Is it Anseruta's brigade that comes ashore?
There's two brigades,
so it's quite clear what's going on by this point. Is there an argument that he does the right thing, or should he have tried to cut and run, or is it too late at this point? Bearing in mind, as you've said earlier, the nearest friendly troops are at Elvash. He can't get up to Almeida at this point because there's a British force in the way and there's a hostile population in between that, even if he were to break through the British lines. Would it have worked? I mean, I'm very skeptical that it would have worked.
Yeah, I mean,
cut and run.
There was, he had a couple of councils of war with his senior staff and generals, and they basically there was very little they could do. There was nowhere to retire to. Even if they got to Elvas, where would they go after that? Because Spain was in uproar, and Dupont had been defeated in the south. So it had been very difficult to actually get anywhere with a march. Juno had been warned by his chief of staff Thibault to make preparations for a siege in Lisbon, because there were defences around Lisbon that could have held up the British, but Juno had not done that. He had not made adequate preparations for a siege. He couldn't even take enough men to face Wellesley. I mean, he had around 26,000 men in Portugal at this stage. But with the garrisons in Almeida and Elvas and a few other points, including Santarem across the Tagus River, there was he could only Juno could only gather about 10,000 men, without completely decimating the garrison at Lisbon, in which case, the population of Lisbon would rise and slaughter them. So he had very few options, and there's quite a lot of indication that he knew the game was up, and his main interest was retaining his loot. Which he had copious amounts of. So, to my mind, the only reason he marched out to face Wellesley was not to drive him back into the sea, because he knew that the British and Portuguese outnumbered him. The only reason to do that, I think, was to stop Napoleon being so disappointed in him. Juno felt that if he surrendered without a fight, Napoleon would never forgive him, and Napoleon's goodwill was more important to him than his lives of his men, I think.
Wow. So almost a vanity battle.
Yeah.
Almost kind of a Trafalgar. Well, Trafalgar is absolutely a vanity battle, isn't it? It's a battle that doesn't need to be fought because a replacement of commanders on the way, and as soon as Villeneuve gets wind of it, he up sticks and sets sails to try and avoid the orders. But that's interesting. I hadn't kind of thought about it that way round in relation to Juno, which does put a different slant on what happens. Having said that, it does feel to me that the French plan at Vimeiro is quite simple. So for folks who aren't familiar with the geography, Vimeiro is now it's a town. I think at the time it would probably have been a small village, barely a mile inland from Porto Novo, which is where these reinforcements are landing. And Wellesley's first position, to me, seems quite imposing. I know we talked a fair bit, and your notes that you sent me were massively helpful in terms of sort of trying to track all of this. I had an argument with a whole bunch of dogs. Like every single dog in Portugal seemed to wake up when I went to the first position. So I don't think I was popular with the locals, funnily enough. But it's a very high, very logical position to hold to protect the landing ground. That all seems fine. And so therefore it's equally logical for the French to go, well, we're not going to attack straight up the hill. We can't go through the sea. Therefore, we'll just outflank it and we'll apply pressure at the village and then send another force to arc up. Obviously, that doesn't go smoothly. That flanking maneuver. But is it fair to say that what he does is the logical, sensible thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, the problem I have with Wellesley's first position is it's only really strong if Juno's marching from the south. Wellesley thought Juno was marching from the south, so he positioned his troops accordingly, but he had no idea where Juno was. French cavalry were, riding right up to British lines, the day before the battle. So the French knew the British position, but the British didn't know where the French were. And I think to deploy, basically that you could only defend in the direction you think the enemy is coming from, and not saying to yourself, okay, well, perhaps they won't do what I think they're going to do. The ridge at the back of the British position, the back of Vimeiro, dominates the whole area. And there was one small picket of the 40th foot on there. So, and given that Wellesley didn't know where the French were, and the French cavalry were so active, it is a very television approach to my mind. Juno rocks up on the morning of the 21st, does, according to his chief of staff, a very quick and dirty recce, and decides to do as he said. He decides that he's going to attack the hill outside Vimeiro, but also send a flanking force around the British rear. So, given that he had half the men. And I'm literally meaning half the men. The exact number 2-1. Had half the men of the Allies. It was a sound plan, but it wasn't one that was ever going to work. You don't. You don't. I think the sort of standard ratio is that the attacker needs, to have double the men of the defender, not the other way around. So I can't see that it was ever going to work. Even if he'd you know, even if the French had actually carried out the plan, adequately, which I don't think they did, because he sent one brigade to do the flanking maneuver, then changed his mind and sent a second. So he wasn't committed to his own plan really.
So the French, we'll break it down in stages. The French go into the town, and it, spoiler alert, folks, it all goes quite pear-shaped. But there is it's not sort of one-way traffic. There is back and forth over this. There is a firefight, and then of course the British cavalry do a British cavalry, and charge too far. So talk us through the action, sort of in the, what I guess then would have been the outskirts of Vimeiro town itself, and then we'll talk about this kind of flanking move to the north in a bit.
So at the time, there was a hill with a couple of windmills on, which basically overlooked the village of Vimeiro. It's built up now, and there's a graveyard there, and there's a museum there. But at the time, it was apparently just a sort of bare hill. And on that hill, which was the far left of the British position, was Fane, with the half of the 60th, the 95th, and the 50th Foot, and then Anstruther with a fairly strong brigade, 97th, 52nd, 43rd, and I'm missing somebody out, but anyway. So there's basically about 7 British battalions plus guns on the hill. Junot sends 2 brigades in column to basically attack that position. They're first engaged by the Royal Artillery, firing shrapnel shells, which explode in the air and shower the troops with musket balls. And contrary to what a lot of accounts say, it wasn't the first time they were used. And the shrapnel shell had been used in Suriname in 1804, and also had been very effective at Rolica. So the French columns, get peppered by shrapnel. On their flanks, they've got the riflemen of the 60th and 95th, picking off their officers and the sergeants, etc. So those 2 columns don't actually get as far as the village. They get basically stopped. They start to falter, and the 50th and the 97th fire volleys and then charge, and those columns are broken. They flee. Junot sends in his reserve, which are 2 regiments of grenadiers, so the grenadier companies from all the French line regiments. And Junot actually goes with them himself, and they take a slightly more direct, roundabout route directly into the village rather than towards the hill. They too get peppered with shrapnel. They make it as far as the church on the outskirts of the village, and get stopped by the 43rd and the 60th and a few other regiments. But again, they get broken, start retreating, and that's when the 20th Light Dragoons and the Portuguese cavalry charge. It's not entirely clear who orders the charge. Some say Wellesley, some say Fane, and Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, the CEO of the 20th Light Dragoons, had been itching for action all the day, so it's quite possible that he decided to do it on his own. But whoever ordered it, the cavalry charge. There is an account that's a couple of accounts that say the Portuguese stopped, but I've found some Portuguese accounts which basically say certainly some carried on. Interestingly, part of the Portuguese cavalry were the Lisbon police, who were basically the only formed paramilitary force that survived, because the army had been disbanded. The Spanish cavalry had given had to give all their horses to the French cavalry. But the Lisbon police were actually retained to maintain order in Lisbon, but they'd all deserted during June and July and joined the Allies. And a couple of accounts from the British dragoons who basically rated them as quite good cavalrymen. And certainly there was evidence that at least some of the Portuguese cavalry did carry on and charge. But also it could be said that perhaps they stopped in time and the British didn't. Yes, it's one of those things where you try and make conclusions out of two or three different accounts that are 2 or 3 lines long. So it's hard to say for certain. One thing I did think after seeing those horses charging through London the other month was that because only half the light dragoon horses were trained cavalry horses, and the rest had been gathered from, one of the British officers gathers a couple of hundred mares, Portuguese mares for the cavalry, which does imply they're not trained cavalry horses.
Yeah.
So you put a trained cavalry horse in that kind of situation, it's not going to stop. So it could be that it wasn't the men losing control; it was the horses losing, losing control. But again, it's not all clear. But all you know for sure is that the dragoons did charge too far. They got countercharged by the French and basically slaughtered. And that had an important, that was an important factor in what came next, because it meant that the Allied cavalry was basically out of play for the rest of the battle.
Absolutely. And what I would say, folks, is the church is still there. The valleys that the French march up are still there. The museum has this sort of glass kind of back wall looking out over the valley that the French push up, and then, as Rob so brilliantly described, don't even make it to the crest. You can walk this town. It is a beautiful part of the world. It's very cheap. It's very rural. If you're looking for a decent restaurant, you're going to want to go back to your hotel. That I will say. But it is. I thoroughly recommend it. I love that part of the world. Very much looking forward to taking people out on tour there later, early next year. So do go and visit it. It's actually very easy to understand. The people at the museum are lovely. Obviously, there is a bit of a language barrier if you're English or if you're American, but they do their absolute damnedest to try and overcome that. It's pretty cheap to get in as well. They've got a lovely little VR experience. I promise I'm not being sponsored by the Portuguese tourist office, but hey, if they want to sponsor this podcast, I'm down for that. But yeah, genuinely go and visit it. It's a very, very navigable battlefield, put it that way, and you can soak in a lot. Having said all of that, there is a part of the battlefield that I struggled to navigate, which is trying to work out precisely where this flanking force that Juno sends actually ends up running sort of headlong almost into Wellesley's redeployment, because he swings. He's not an idiot. He sees the threat and swings to meet it. And I can find the general ridge, and you were incredibly helpful in terms of going, look, it's here. But I must admit, I was kind of going, but what is it, that bit or is it that bit? Where I probably should have tried to do it from the French perspective as well, and that might have given me more clarity. But I was trying to pack too much into a single day. So I never got to kind of definitively work out where are the key clashes with all of this. But let's put my incompetence to one side. Talk us through what actually happens, because this is a bit of a messy affair, isn't it?
Yeah, and the history of it is clouded because it's falsely claimed by Oman by Charles Oman in his history and several other articles he wrote. It's falsely claimed that the British were deployed on the reverse slope, which they weren't. If you look at I found a couple of fantastic contemporary maps at the National Archives, drawn by officers who were there, and just after the battle, between Vimeiro and the later Corona campaign, and it's quite clear that Wellesley was more wrong-footed than Oman claims. If you read Oman's account of the battle, Wellesley spotted the flanking manoeuvre and put troops up the ridge in time for them to be on the reverse slope and counter the French as they came up the hill. But if you read, British accounts, especially from the brigades who were there, there's a great account from the 40th and a few other battalions. But it's clear that the French got there pretty much before the British. So Junot sent two brigades around that flank. One was led by Brenier, and that was the first march. And Brenier came up to basically a defile at the base of the ridge and decided it was not good enough to take his guns over. And so did a long march around towards a village called, I think, Luriniha. It's got like all the Swiftly accents and stuff on, I don't know how to pronounce it. Anyway, basically, there's a good implication that Brenier got lost. The second brigade that Junot sent was led by a Solignac. And he got the same defile and thought, oh, I can do that. And he marched his troops up there and got to the top of the ridge well before the British brigades were actually on the ridge. So there's a little hamlet called Ventosa at the top of that ridge. It's a very long ridge. It's a good couple of hundred meters, over the surrounding countryside. But then as you go north, it gradually fades into the sort of cliffs around the coast. And so Solignac got there off there before, and British accounts say that French dragoons had actually driven off the pickets there at about 8 o'clock, about the same time as the attack was starting near Vimeiro. As soon as those news of the French dragoons came, Wellesley did think, oh God, I've got my troops facing south and they're not coming from south. And he transferred the bulk of his troops up there. But it took him a while to get up there, especially it's quite a hill. The infantry had to help the guns up the hill. But by the time Ferguson, who was in the lead brigade, got there, Solignac was already deployed in Ventosa. So the French had the high ground. Ferguson was farther down this long slope, and he was out of sight of the French purely because it's a very long slope and slightly curved. And the light companies of Ferguson's brigade and a couple of others, and the French light infantry skirmished for a good couple of hours while things went on down around Vimeiro. Solignac, I think, was waiting for Brenier to turn up. Once Brenier came in sight, Solignac then marched his troops forward. Ferguson countercharged, drove the French back. And what you have is that the British basically drive Solignac back along the ridge and then down sort of the back slope of the ridge. Brenier then countercharges, comes up and countercharges, Ferguson and his men. They are stopped by the British, the Highlanders of the 71st, and other units. And, Brenier's taken. And generally, it's an action where the British, do their old thing of firing a volley, doing a bayonet charge, driving the French back.
So that brings us to sort of the close of the action, but the controversy just starts at that point. You have alluded to this already, the failure to follow up the remnants of the French forces. British cavalry is, basically, for all intents and purposes, non-existent at this point in the battle. Wellington being prevented from pursuing, even though he wants to and urges his superiors to do so when he is so preceded in the moment of victory. Lots of questions about the competence of the people coming in, whether or not they've got the stomach for the fight, whether they really want this kind of command. Um, so, in amongst all of that, what's your view on it? Because this blows up into what will become the Sintra controversy, the
Yeah.
signing of the convention, and the argument being that had Wellesley been able to pursue as he wanted to, then he could have ripped Juno apart, and then there would have been it would have been a dictated peace rather than a negotiated peace, effectively. Um, but you can take a good argument too far,
Yeah.
and you've made the point. Look, the French have cavalry, the British don't. What are you going to pursue with? Because you can pursue with infantry, but deploy a cavalry force, and you're going to negate that advance anyway. So, what's your take on it all?
So a bit of background first. Wellesley was in charge of the 9,000 men from Cork and Spencer, so he had about 14, 15,000 men. As soon as they started getting reports of the true French strength, Admiral Cotton sent back a report basically saying the French have got about 25,000 men. And so as soon as that got back into London, they thought, okay, well, obviously Wellesley's not got enough men for the job. We'll send through Anstruther and Ackland, and also Moore. General Sir John Moore had been in Sweden and come back with again about 10,000 men, and he was going to be sent as well. So a force of about 30,000 men was too big for a junior lieutenant general to command. So a senior commanders had to be found. The logical choice was Sir Hugh Dalrymple in Gibraltar, because he had good relations with the Spanish. He knew the area and all that kind of thing. But the trouble was, Moore wasn't going to take particularly well to being superseded. And Burrard, so Harry Burrard was chosen because he got on well with Moore and could be a good second in command to Dalrymple. What happens is Burrard sails with Moore, but goes ahead in a frigate and reaches Porto Novo near Vimeiro the day before the battle. Wellesley was planning to march south towards Mafra, and Burrard said, no, let's wait for more, which is, cautious, but perfectly reasonable. Burrard lets Wellesley manage the Battle of Vimeiro. He says, he basically says, go ahead, you've got it, no problem. As the battle ends, Wellesley says, let's pursue. And, Wellesley had given Burrard a very thorough and honest report at State of the Army the night before, saying, we've got no cavalry. The artillery horses are crap. Our supply situation's not great. And then obviously comes Burrard and says, let's leg it and chase the French. And Burrard knows that 20th Light Dragoons are basically out of action. Several rounds of French artillery have hit the commissariats at the back of Vimeiro, and they're in chaos. Half the wagons are needed to deal with the wounded anyway. And there's, as I said, doubts about the fitness of the artillery horses. So when Wellesley says, well, Hill's brigade has been sitting around doing nothing all day, let's get them, they're in the sort of most southerly of the British units, let's get them, heading towards Torres Vedras to cut off the French. Burrard says no. He just weighs everything up, and as far as he's only just got there, the information he's got says it's a bit too risky. Officers who survey the battleground and the area after the battle say that if the British had marched, they could have cut the French off. But as you say, the French had superior cavalry. it can been quite easy for them to do a couple of cavalry charges and stop the British infantry. And a second battle would have to have been fought somewhere. The area around Taurus Vedrus is quite good for defence, as well as it itself proved a couple of years later. So what would have happened is unclear. Wellesley himself says that Burrard had good military reasons not to pursue it. He was annoyed, and I'm sure the situation would have been there's a good chance things could be improved, but there's a good chance things might have gone wrong as well. So it's one of those situations where I've never had to command troops in battle. So I'm not going to judge someone for being cautious, rather than Moore was by this stage at Mondego Bay, just a few miles up the coast. So he was expected any day, and he, in fact, he began to turn up 2 or 3 days after the battle. So from Burrard's point of view, more forces were on the way. It was a safer thing to do to hang fire.
So how do you assess Wellesley's performance over the course of this campaign? And also, I'm curious about your take on the suggestion that Wellesley ends up being more gung-ho because he knows that he's going to be superseded and he's got a point to prove, which is an accusation that's sometimes leveled at the guy. We can quote, Wellesley from Wellington as he is then, from later in the Peninsular War, and how he's all very frugal with his men's lives when he is in overall an undisputed command. But do you think he's more kind of up an atom, as he allegedly said at Waterloo, during this campaign, or do you think that this is a young guy who's cutting his teeth but doing a reasonable job within the sort of the limits of the orders that he's done, and his actions are legitimate?
One thing I find most curious is his assessment of intelligence. There were lots and lots of reports coming into him, and a lot of them were contradictory. A lot of them were wrong. There was rumors of Spanish victories and Spanish defeats left, right, and centre. And there were lots of estimates of the French force at around about 15,000, something like that. But Admiral Cotton had 3 Hanoverian deserters from a French unit had got onto Royal Naval ships and given Cotton a fairly accurate breakdown of the French force at about 25,000. Interesting as well, Lord Strangford, who was the British ambassador in Lisbon just prior to the embarkation in 1807, had also sent a very accurate report of the forces at Bayonne at about 25,000. So there shouldn't have been a huge amount of debate that the French had about 25,000 men. But Wellesley only tends to believe the 15,000 mark. He's very insistent. He dismisses the higher numbers. And as it turns out, Juno could only gather the smaller amount. But from the point of view of him, he could have, according to his orders, waited at Mondego Bay for the reinforcements. That would have been, no one would have criticised him for that, given that, the level of, the numbers of the French in Portugal. But he dismisses that and says, they've only got 15,000. I'll march south. And to be fair, his strength in this campaign is, in the operational side of things. He has to, as soon as he lands, he's dealing with his Commissary General Pipon, who basically loses the plot and can't cope. There's not enough transport, not enough supplies. And so he gathers all that, he fixes those problems, and the march south is very well handled. You can, there's several, there's always several columns, and you read his orders of the day, and you can see, he's He's planning the marches well. You can see how he's adapting to things like changing the number of pickets there are and this type of thing. So, the whole way that the army marches down, towards Lisbon is very well handled. Strategically, um, sticking to the coast is also exactly the right thing to do. He handles that all very well. Tactically, his plan for Rolica is fine, but badly handled. His initial position at Vimeiro is questionable, in that it only focuses on the attack from one direction. But he wins both battles. And especially at Vimeiro, I think he's ably supported by some very good brigade commanders. He often, the sort of standard thing is that Wellesley always had to cope with crap, brigade and divisional commanders. But actually, if Ferguson, Anstruther, Fane. I mean, Fane was a cavalry officer who'd never commanded any infantry and was given the light brigade. He seems to perform very well. Anstruther was a solid, experienced officer who Wellesley actually wanted him to be the quartermaster general, but Anstruther wanted a brigade instead, and he handled his brigade very well. At one point, Wellesley offers him extra support, during the battle, and Anstruther says, basically, I'm beating the French, thanks. I don't need, I don't need any help. And then Ferguson and Spencer on the ridge, countering the French flank attack, seem to go very well. It is actually hard to find that much mention of Wellesley, amongst the reports of the battle. It's not that I'm thinking he didn't manage the battle. It's just there's not much evidence of it. So I think a lot of the success of Vimeiro is, can be put down to the brigade commanders, which as it should be. He Wellesley placed the brigades, where they needed to be, and brigade commanders then managed the battle. So I think overall, his performance is fine. He does. He's, in his private letters, he's very quick to apportion blame elsewhere. After Rolica, he writes to one of his brothers that there were 3 mistakes, and none of which were his fault. And to some extent, I think if you're going to claim the credit for battles that go well, you've got to take the blame for when they don't as well. But no, I mean, the other thing that is always difficult, at this stage of his career is filtering out the Wellington of Waterloo to the Wellesley of Vimeiro. Because so many of the memoirs are written after Waterloo, with his, knowing that he went on to be a successful general, that it's sometimes hard to really find out what people thought of him at that time.
It does indeed colour the perception. Rob, you've been so generous with your time. That's nearly 2 hours going through, frankly, what is one of the simpler and less kind of certainly tactically complex campaigns of the war, which gives folks an idea of the level of detail that this guy has, just the ability to hold in his head. And it's entirely reflected in your book, So Just and Glorious a Cause. People keep listening because there will be a discount code that I will give you at the end of this episode. Yes, I'm going to make you stay to the very end to hear that. But Rob, thank you so much for your time. Folks, whilst you're going to hellion.co.uk to get the book, and go to Hellion, support authors rather than supporting Uncle Jeff. You know my previous rants on that, and Amazon and Jeff Bezos and Rocket Fuel. We don't need to repeat them. So go direct to hellion.co.uk. But while you're there, whilst you're enjoying yourself, whilst you're on that kind of midsummer shopping spree, why don't you pick up Rob's other titles? So Rifleman, which looks at the 5th Battalion, 60th Regiment, and his book on, I can never pronounce this properly, Arroyo de Molinos. Did I get it right in terms of pronunciation?
Arroyo Molinos.
Okay, you've heard the expert say it rather than me. Fantastic books, both very well received. I haven't seen the reviews yet for Suggest and Glorious Accords, but everybody's anticipating that this is going to be fantastic. So I have no doubt, no hesitation in saying that you're going to need this book in your life. Yes, we have a fair few campaign histories that seem to sort of make their way onto the market from time to time, but quality is important. And this is a quality study. So, folks, go and get this. So just and glorious a cause. Hellion.co.uk. Rob, thank you so much for your time,
You're
and I look
welcome.
forward to seeing you very soon.
It's a pleasure.
To enjoy 15% off So Just and Glorious a Cause, type code NWP15 into the checkout at hellion.co.uk. Hello again, folks. Please remember, we're still fighting back from that Spotify nightmare. So please do two really simple and quick things to help us rise from the ashes. First, whack that subscribe button, especially if you're listening to this on Spotify, because you're likely to have been disconnected. But whatever platform you listen to your podcasts on, please just do it anyway to make sure you can stay connected to us. Second, like and leave a comment. It helps bump us up the algorithm to reconnect with our lost audience. If you're a fan of the show, you can leave a 5-star review. Go on, you know you want to. And did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and all the hot gossip about what's coming soon? Because let's be honest, this show is all about the hot gossip. To sign up, go to www.thenapoleonicwars.net. Much love to all my Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording this in mid-August 2024, are in the mentioned and dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schrager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals: John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Laird Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically named Zed. And I promise that's not just me boosting the numbers. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.